I'm going to do the presentation today on how to write a good systematic review and meta-analysis, which you guys hopefully can publish in the end. So all of you have like sort of different years of experience and different sort of years in your medical studies. So I hope this presentation will kind of help you sort of kickstart and streamline that process of getting from that idea of a research question to the ultimate publication. And yeah, so as Zoe said, my name is Santhosh Thava. I'm a fifth-year medical student from Imperial College London, and I have a fair amount of experience in neurosurgical research. Before I start, talking to you guys about systematic reviews and meta-analysis and how exactly to do them, I just want to like set the tone a bit and say that like the idea that writing a systematic review is something super complex and only like researchers can do, like try to lose that idea and look at it in a more simple way, because really it's not rocket science. It's intellectually not that demanding once you know which steps exactly to take. If you don't know that, yes, it would seem like hopeless, but once you know exactly how to approach it in a systematic way, in a step-by-step way, it's not very intellectually demanding. However, it does require a lot of stamina and patience. So what is a bit more intellectually demanding and complicated is the meta-analysis, as one of the speakers in the beginning brought up as well. It is definitely a bit more difficult than just a systematic review, but meta-analysis is ultimately what makes your systematic review really, really valid. You know about the pyramid of evidence, and the systematic review is basically at the top of things. But it's really only at the top of things if you're including a meta-analysis as well. Because a meta-analysis basically adds statistical validity to your systematic review. If you don't have a meta-analysis, it's purely a qualitative synthesis, which offers a nice overview, and it's still an impressive piece of work, but it's significantly less likely to get published, especially in good neurosurgical journals. So nonetheless, meta-analysis is still doable if you know how to code, if you know statistics. But even if you don't know these two things, if you're a keen learner who can, who is willing to teach themselves even, it is perfectly doable. Other medical students have done it, so I don't see why you couldn't. So the overall most challenging part though of the systematic review and meta-analysis isn't even all these steps down the line. No, it's actually the first step of finding like a truly meaningful research question. That is the most important and most difficult thing to do as well. And that is why you should actually take a lot of time to find a truly meaningful research question, because you don't want a generic question. Number one, a generic question that already has been answered, and a question that is not really that relevant to clinical practice. Because ultimately, if you produce a piece of scientific work, you want it, well, in our case, to push the neurosurgical field forward. So just keep those three things in mind. So I just want to give you a short outline, almost like a blueprint of how to approach a systematic review in like, I think about 10 steps. So number one step, before you get into it and start the systematic review, form a balanced and intellectually able team. And I know everybody is a medical student here and everybody is smart, but let's say in a medical school, not everybody will be necessarily scientifically apt. That's just how it is. A lot of people are very good at memorizing things and are rightfully so becoming doctors, because a lot of being a doctor is about memory recognition. But for scientific work, well, unless you write maybe a case report, for this kind of work, it is very important to be able to do some abstract thinking as well. So keep that in mind when forming your team. Then once you have your team, it is important to expose yourself to the aim field. So you guys want to do pediatric neurosurgery. So it's important to just have a good grasp of the literature that is out there right now. So if you just go on PubMed or on any pediatric neurosurgery journal and just read the latest research, then you kind of get a gist of what are hot topics, right? And then if you are in the hospital as well, ideally, like on a pediatric neurosurgery elective, then you can sort of like try to find a link. You can see, okay, what is being researched right now, what are the hot topics, but how is it being implemented in clinical practice, where are the gaps. Like, for example, if you observe the doctors doing a certain procedure, but you think, maybe this could be done differently, that could be done differently, go back home and have a read on the literature on it. And if there's no literature on it, there you go, there you have your gap. So once you have found your research question, do some market research. So when a company tries to bring out a product, they need to go to their audience and see if they actually like it, like the idea first, right? So with journals, with neurosurgical publications, in the end, it's going to be neurosurgeons who read it. So once you have the research question, just go to anybody, any neurosurgeon, like if you have the context, or in your, just write them an email, and don't ask necessarily yet for supervision. Like supervision, that's a whole different sort of play, but just ask them for their opinion if they think that this is a meaningful question to be answered. Once you have done that, you can proceed either, involving a supervisor if you want. I'd not include a supervisor at this point yet, because number one, a supervisor will sort of like be hesitant to, hold your hand through the entire process, because it's going to be a bit of a pain for them. And secondly, it's a lot more impressive if you already have a draft and then look for a supervisor, because then they know, okay, these guys have already done quite a lot and to a sufficient standard, and now he can sort of like polish that stone into a diamond, really. So then once you have the research question, you perform the systematic review and you make your tables first. And once you have like all the data in the tables, you can then collate the data, basically like the quantitative data, so the numbers, and try to run a meta-analysis. And then you make your graphs with that meta-analysis. And then you do a risk of bias analysis for the included study and publication bias as well. So one of the colleagues was saying earlier that they were wondering how to sort of like objectively analyze different studies, and this is the step of doing it. I'll go into depth more about this later, but basically there are different objective scoring or quality assessment tools, such as the ROB tool or the Robbins 1 tool. If you just go on Cochrane and even Google risk of bias tools, then plenty will come up, and they're all for slightly different sort of studies. So, for example, randomized control trials will need a different tool to, for example, case control studies. So once you've done the risk of bias analysis, you have three sort of like different like figures, I'd say. Like you have a table, you have a graph, graphs of the meta-analysis, and you have the graphs for the risk of bias analysis. And then you can really start writing the paper up. And just from experience, it's best to start from the methods, because it's the most straightforward thing to do. And then you write the results, and only then you write the introduction, okay? And once you've done that, it's good to, go to your supervisor and ask them, okay, does this all make sense, right? If you're unsure about things, because you don't want to go into the discussion if you know, okay, your results is probably flawed. But if you're confident about your results, you can go, and that's how I usually do it. You go straight into the discussion and you finish it all the way up to the conclusion, and that's your first draft, right? And it's good to sort of split the work among the different group members, but you have to monitor each other, and then the discussion is best written together. And once you've done all that, you send that draft to either a supervisor or, in my opinion, you don't necessarily need a classical supervisor. You can just ask other neurosurgeons for their co-authorship and then involve them in the final editing of the paper. And then they're the senior co-authors or senior colleagues working on that paper, because I do find like sometimes senior neurosurgeons, if you invite them as supervisors, they might, in a way take the project from you and sell it as their idea. And that's not the whole point of this either, right? Okay, and then once you get their feedback, then you basically start a cycle of constant revision. And then ultimately, when everybody's happy with it, you submit it to the journal. So before you start the meta-analysis and the systematic review, I recommend you to read two things. So one is basically, well, they're both on the same website. It's on the Cochrane training website. And Cochrane reviews are sort of the most valid systematic reviews of meta-analyses out there. So Cochrane reviews, the teams consist of really big people in the respective fields, and there's Cochrane review groups for gastrosurgery, for orthosurgery, and neurosurgery as well. So it's good to sort of like take their approach because they are really like the highest in terms of standards. So if you go on their website, they have a sort of like a step-by-step guide on how to do things on their website for both systematic review but also meta-analyses. And it's good to sort of have a read of that before you even embark on this journey. So regarding the team building, ideally teams of 3 I would recommend, maximum 4, but really 3 is really sufficient. Why can't you do it alone? Well, if you do it alone, nobody's going to accept the paper as a publication because the risk of bias is extremely high. Why not have 4, 5, 6 in one group? Purely because it will lead to a lot of micromanaging, and you want a coherent piece of work. And if many different people write it, that means a lot of different styles of writing. So it's not going to be like a stringent piece of work. So a team of 3 is totally sufficient. And it's important to form sort of a balanced team. Try to get people in, or have a balance of egos. You don't want people with too big people with egos clashing against each other. And it's important to get to know each other, and importantly, each other's strengths and weaknesses as well, but also accept those. Because then when you're all on the same page, you can work efficiently together. It's important to be professional with each other, friendly, yeah, because in the end, you're all in the same boat. And if one person, is frustrated and doesn't do their job properly, that section will be bad and your whole paper will be rejected on its weakest link. So as a sort of like rule of thumb, it's good to have one person who's good at scientific writing, and is good at like abstract thinking. I mean, everybody has to be good at abstract thinking, but yeah, mainly is good at scientific writing. One person who is good at coding or has like, is good with mathematics anyway. That person can do the meta-analysis. And one person you need who does a bit, I don't want to say the menial tasks, but the tasks that require more patience and concentration as well, such as writing the references correctly, checking all the numbers, and basically cleaning up after the other two's work. Because nobody's perfect, everybody does mistake, but that person has to be the one that spots the mistake. And it's actually one of the most important roles. So once you have your team and have an idea of what you want to do, that's sort of like a nice flow chart of how to go about, going from the research question number 1 to finally like the manuscription number 14. And this is taken from one of the papers I found, and it's basically nicely puts out. So for the research question, there is something called PICO. I never use it, but everybody always brings it up. It basically is about, okay, when you write a research question, you want to define your population, your intervention, and those sort of things. So for example, are we looking at a pediatric or adult population? What intervention are we using? And then see comparator, what is the comparator? So you can do that, but usually when you're trying to write a research question, as long as you make it super precise, yeah, so it shouldn't just be like, I don't know, 4 or 5 words. It should be a longer sentence that you're trying to answer. And then that question you can then, transform into your title by just taking away the question mark and adding a systematic review meta-analysis to it. Once you've done that, you search the database for all papers that are on basically discussing this research question. And for that, you can use Ovid. Ovid basically gives you access to Embase and Medline. And those are the most important ones, really. PubMed, Scopus, all those less important. You still have to screen them, but you can just do manual search for them. So you do the searching, and then you do the full, basically you screen all of them, then you select which ones you really want, which ones don't fit your sort of like inclusion criteria, and which one sort of have to be excluded because they fit your exclusion criteria. So yeah, at this stage, you also have to define, okay, what are my inclusion criteria? What are the exclusion criteria? So commonly exclusion criteria are if they are in a different language or if they are in a different setting. So in this case, for example, adults, or you have like specific inclusion criteria. For example, it must look at this specific test. So once you've done that, you can then follow up and extract the data and then get on with writing the manuscript. But I get more into detail about that. And then just, yeah, for the data extraction. So data extraction basically means, so you screen all the papers and you're trying to extract data regarding the intervention, the population, etc., out of it. And you can do it all in Excel, but it's going to be a bit of a pain. And there are tools out there which really make your life easier. And one of them is Covidence, for example. And yeah, quality assessment, I already said there are tools out there for that as well. And then for the meta-analysis, you can use either Stata or R for meta-analysis, both different sort of like languages. And R is a bit more difficult, but it gives you a more powerful meta-analysis, and then Excel for just data collection. And yeah, the manuscript writing, just do a shared drive, shared Word, and then everybody can sort of like look and edit it. So how do you do a database screening? So a database screening, let me try share my screen and maybe we can just do that together. So can everybody, one second, I need to share a new screen. Okay. Can you see my screen? I think you can.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, cool. So this basically, okay, you check Embase and Medline, forget about these others unless you're looking for something maternity related. You press on OK, and then it will lead you to sort of a search engine. Oh my God, okay, fine. So let's say now you want to look at like pediatric hydrocephalus and shunts, okay? Then you can just do pediatric hydrocephalus, shunting, and you want to look at complications, right? So now, if usually you can use and or you can use or, but be aware if you do an and, right? Like you would think, okay, that a lot of studies will come up when you sort of search for this search string. But in reality, okay, my internet is being super slow. But in reality, usually searches like this wouldn't give you much. Yeah, here you go. You get 9. That's ridiculous. And it's purely because this search engine works in a logical way. So every time you put an and in, it means all the studies that maybe talk about pediatric hydrocephalus and complications, but they don't talk about shunting, those papers will be excluded. So the more specific you make your search string, the more likely you are to exclude papers falsely by default without you even having looked at them. So my recommendation is try to make the search string super broad, even if that means that you're screening thousands of papers. Like I did a systematic review on normal pressure hydrocephalus. I was only looking at one little thing, but we ended up screening 8,000 papers, right? And we found a lot of papers that didn't even have in their title what we were looking for, but had it somewhere hidden in the text. And if we hadn't done the really broad search, we would have missed out some really important papers. All right, let's go back to this. Fine. So you do that, and basically there are mesh words like these, for example. For example, if you're looking for anything related, like in teenagers, in children, you can use these sort of stars, yeah, because sometimes a title will say child, a title will say children, but if you want to include all those words, just put a star there, and it will cover all the searches and titles with that stem, and it just makes your life easier. In terms of like semantics, be careful. Like especially if you're making things a bit more specific, you run the danger of not including all synonyms. So for example, if you're looking for a paper on AIDS and you're just putting it into the search string, not all papers will abbreviate it, and not all papers will write it exactly the same way. So be a bit creative and try to come up with as many synonyms as you can. Yeah, like AIDS, and then you can also do HIV. So there's a lot of synonyms, and try to include them all so you don't miss anything out. And then yeah, beware of spelling as well. There's a lot of UK research, there's a lot of US research, and both are important. Cool. And then talking about Boolean operators. So, and I really dislike the AND operator because it excludes a lot of papers. It makes the search too specific. Equally, or is tricky as well. It's good if you want to insert synonyms, but it just broadens up things, and you're trying to like minimize that sort of like width of search results you're trying to get. So overall, I think personally, my recommendation would be not even bother with and or, just keep it super broad. You're going to have to screen a lot more, but in the end, if you miss out a paper and one of the reviewers of the paper, so peer reviewers, finds it, then you're screwed. All right, so regarding Covidence, the data tool, I mean, you can get a free trial, which is sufficient really. And basically it's a nice sort of like interface for you to dump in all your screens and then assign different reviews to different things. So everybody basically screens the papers in a blinded way. And then when there are disagreements regarding whether to include or exclude things, then a third reviewer can decide whether to include or exclude it. So it really ensures validity in your sort of like first step. And yeah, extraction, that last step I wouldn't do in Covidence personally, because it's not a good extraction software per se. I would just extract it. Once you know what you want to put into your table, you can extract it into an Excel spreadsheet. So yeah, and this is really how it looks like. Right, so the data extraction, you want to be into Excel, so be clear what information you want in there. So study details, like methods, population, what intervention you're looking at, and the outcomes as well. Because ultimately, whatever you put now into the Excel, keep in mind that you want to make it as good as possible. So in the end, when you're making your tables, which is going to have the same sort of columns almost, you want to make sure, don't plagiarize, don't copy and paste. Okay, you can't copy and paste, but then at least, try to reword it heavily. Because then you can take that input from the Excel spreadsheet and put it into the tables. So once you're done with that, with the tables, do a risk assessment, because the studies are still fresh in your head. So you don't want to leave it to the last minutes, at which you might have even forgotten about most of them. So for the risk assessment, that's one of the colleagues was asking about earlier. So find your tool. So for example, the ROB2 tool or the ROB1 tool, they are used for different sort of study designs. Just Google, for example, randomized controlled trial, quality assessment tool, and it will give you the most up-to-date version of the perfect tool. And at Cochrane, they have different ones as well. There's a CASP one, a CASP is not that great. anything that starts with an R is usually good. So Rob1, sorry, Rob2, Robbins1, and I think there's a Robbins2 as well. So, and yeah, basically you can download these forms from the internet, and it goes through each sort of category, and you have to score them. Okay, is there a huge bias in, for example, participant selection? Is there a huge bias in, for example, measuring the treatment effect? And sure, now if you're filling it out, each one of you is probably going to come to a slightly different conclusion. There is a level of subjectivity even here. So before you go embark on this, learn how to critically appraise papers. Just YouTube it, just Google it. How do I critically appraise a paper? And it is something you need to know how in order to know how strict you can be with a paper, because if you're overly strict, then you're just over scrutinizing the database as well. And again, this is ideally also done by two people differently, and then you can just look at both and then involve the third person on your team and then resolve any conflicts. Yeah, and ultimately that should give you sort of a traffic light plot like this. And that you can code in R or Stata as well. Alternatively, you can make it in PowerPoint, but it's a bit of a pain. Fine. So then your Prisma, the famous Prisma chart for the methods, is something you really can just download off the internet, and then you just fill in the things that apply to your search. So in order to be able to fill in a succinct Prisma, is actually a really easy thing to do, allowing that you have tracked everything accordingly. So as soon as you start your project, keep minutes. So minutes basically means like a study protocol. Every day you have a meeting, every day you do something, you update it with the date and say, what have we done today? And keep track of everything, of all the numbers. So in the end, you don't have to wonder, okay, how many, for example, studies were there actually? How much did we screen? How much did we exclude? But you don't have to be too neurotic about things either, because the Prisma works in a mathematical way, as you can see. So you can just add up things or subtract things. But just make sure the numbers all add up, or the manuscript is going to be sent back to you. Then regarding the tables, just discuss with your team, agree on columns and rows, and then you can make the table in Word using the table function. And then ideally, either if you make different tables, you can split the tables and assign one person to each table. And then, yeah, you just fill it out based on sort of like that Excel data sheet, yeah? Fine. And then now the meta-analysis, which is one of the most important things like your paper can offer. And that's really what's going to make your paper stand out. So ideally, though, at this point, those who aren't involved with the meta-analysis, one person can do alone, to be honest. A second person can be of auxiliary nature and just, you know, help out with, for example, data collection, or just help the other person by cross-checking results. So basically the way I would recommend things to be done is one person does a meta-analysis and the other two already go into the methods and try to write that. And the way to write a method, just look at other papers, other systematic reviews in that field, in that journal you're trying to publish to, and then just copy sort of like their structure, okay? Don't copy them word by word, obviously, but every journal has sort of like a different structure of things. And that really goes for all sections. Make it really specific to each journal. So if you want to say, you decide you want to go for JNS, look at their word count, look at how they want things structured, and equally that goes for, you know, ACTA or world neurosurgery. Yeah, so meta-analysis should be done by someone who is good with numbers, who has maybe some experience in coding. If you don't, you can learn it on YouTube, and you can learn it by reading the manuals online as well. But it is tricky. And so ideally you want to get a biostatistician somebody with biostatistics experience on the job. And yeah, obviously they'll want authorship as well, but that's really what will, you know, take your systematic review to the next level and will amplify your chances of getting published by 50. Equally, if you write a meta-analysis and it's wrong, like, and you are not very confident about coding or mathematics or statistics, you might miss a little mistake, which could lead to false science being produced. And at latest, the peer reviewers would pick this up. And then if your whole discussion is based on the results of your meta-analysis, you can see what trouble you've sort of landed yourself in. But yeah, you can learn it, and it is definitely not really rocket science either. And a good sort of platform I would recommend if you are keen on coding, learning coding, and I would recommend everybody to learn how to code, is DataCamp. Right, so how do you do a meta-analysis? So apart from the obvious stuff, a good website for this is Bookdown. So Bookdown, especially for R, they have a very comprehensive sort of like step-by-step guide on how to do things, and it's perfectly free. So that's a good guide to sort of use. And even I use it nowadays if I've forgotten about certain elements of the meta-analysis. So basically the steps to the meta-analysis are: you want to collate your data into Excel, then feed the data into R, and then write the code on what you want to analyze, and that will generate you the plots. And then you can copy those plots into Word SharePoint. So yeah, so regarding collecting data, for example, this is, the whole collection of data is almost like dichotomous. It depends on whether you're trying to do a meta-analysis for a diagnostic tool or for a treatment. Like those are the two things that are where it's most valuable really to do a meta-analysis, apart from the epidemiology. So for diagnostic efficiency, you need like true positives and false negatives of things. So that's where you look at the studies and then you collate them into like an Excel spreadsheet. And there is a way it needs to be written. So whenever you, you know, for example, want to do a diagnostic efficiency meta-analysis, it's super important to have these columns. So TP, FN, FP, and TN. So true positive, false negative, false positives, and true negative. If you're ever at a point where you know how to do the meta-analysis itself, but you're not sure about data, like data extraction necessarily, or data collection, everything is online, and it's on our Bookdown as well, and it's on YouTube as well. Because I remember being in a position where I knew, okay, I know how to write the code, but I don't know how to organize the data. But then if you go on YouTube, there are people who are doing it from the scratch. So, and this is the scratch, and it is actually the most important thing: proper, clean data preparation. Because if you have an error here, then everything is for waste. So for this step, it's very good to have the others in your group, at least one other person, just cross-check everything. Now, if it's a treatment efficiency meta-analysis, like this is a different project where it was looking at sort of like the use of AR. And here it is, okay, how good is AR as sort of like a treatment? So you're looking at the treatment effect. So here you need the means and the standard deviations for each study. But unlike for the diagnostic group, you now need controls here as well. So if a study only looks at the treatment group but doesn't look at the comparison groups, then it's a bit meaningless because you can't calculate the effect size. So yeah, you need both. So once you've done that, you write your code. And for this, for example, if you're doing a meta-analysis on the treatment effect size, you need to use meta. If you're writing a meta-analysis on diagnostic efficiency of things, then you need to use a different package, which is called MADA package. And if you're, I don't know, studying analysis X and you don't know which package to use, just Google it. often the answer is on a statistical or programming forum, and then you can just use that. And all packages are free on the CRAN R project website, and you just, it takes a bit of time to read and understand, but you'll get there. It's not very, very complicated. Right. So how do you write your code? So, okay, let me change the screen for this. Okie dokie. Can you see my screen? I think you can. Okay. Cool. So TT stands for, let's say, tap test. So it stands for tap test, and you're trying to see, is tap test sort of like a good diagnostic test. So you had all your data here, which you had collected from the Excel. You write it out as a data frame. And here again, if you remember the Excel spreadsheet, so you have your true positives, your false negatives, your false positives, and your true negatives. So you write them out, and then, so by the way, the R program is free and can be downloaded online. So you run it, and now you see up here, it has created sort of that variable. So it's in your desk. Once you've done that, you add sort of like the names of the different studies to it, right? So now if you can see down here, it has associated those true, positive, etc. values with sort of each author name. So this is basically the same as what was in your Excel spreadsheet now, okay? So we're still at the very beginning. So if all this seems a bit like bogus to you, don't worry. Like once you learn the basics of R programming, it will actually make a lot more sense. But I'll give you a short overview just to show you that actually it's not a lot of lines that you need to code. So once you have your data set here now what you can do is you have the MATLAB function, which is basically like the meta-analysis formula or code to do this, and is 3 lines, okay? And now if you look down here, what it's done is, let me just make this bigger, right? Okay. It's calculated now the diagnostic accuracies for each one of these. And the beautiful thing is now, it's calculating sensitivity and specificity, and it's combining both, right? So sensitivity is sort of like the ability of a test to pick up who has the disease, and specificity is the ability of the test to say confidently that a person is negative if they don't have the disease. So it's both important for if you're evaluating a test. And that output is given to you by R. So if, for example, a diagnostic odds ratio of 52 basically can be translated, if you don't know what it means, just Google it, like I did back then, and it will tell you that diagnostic odds ratio tells you if it's 52, a person who tests positive here is 52 more likely to have the disease compared to somebody who doesn't test positive on this test. So once you've done that, another 2 lines. So it's really not more than that. But now, so you see how I have used that mata TT here, and that created that variable. I'm using the same sort of variable here again. Yeah, just selecting everything, running, and it'll give you a basic forest plot. Now, you have this, it's just the specificity here, the specificity, and this one is for the sensitivity. But as I said, for diagnostic odds ratio, it is important to kind of include both. And I realize I'm going into depth a bit about especially this diagnostic meta-analysis, but I want you to, more than understanding this specific example, just understand the way of thinking, because everything in coding goes step by step. You need to fill every step before the program can logically infer the next step. So once you've built that foundation for the program, you can then use the MATA-UNI function, which basically unifies specificity and sensitivity into one. And I probably sound super complex right now, but I didn't come up with this myself, right? And I'm making it maybe sound like I did, but I didn't. It's all in the R package, and all you have to do is basically, well, maybe not copy and paste, but just write out exactly the steps that they outline in the package. So then you do this, which gives you now the summary plot. And this is now for the diagnostic odds ratio, right? The combined value. And this is now univariate analysis. So it sort of looks like at things in an isolated way. It looks at study one and doesn't necessarily compare it to study two. You can visually compare it, yes, but the analysis itself, the program doesn't compare them all together. For that, you need a bivariate analysis, and that, for example, in this context would be the S-ROC curve. So then you do this, and like this is a beautiful graph, and that's sort of like the standard of graph you want to get things published. And you see, this is what? This is 70, not even 70. This is like maybe 50 lines of coding you need to do. It's really not much coding you need to do. All the rest here is basically a repetition just for the other tests, okay? So if anybody tells you like it's super complex to do that, it's not. You just need to sit down and, you know, be patient, and you will get error shooting, and then you just have to be patient, figure out your mistake, and it'll be worth it in the end. Cool. Oh yeah, no, before I get into that, I want to show one more thing, because I got a question about the weighted analysis. So let's see, where's my Excel? Right, okay. So for the weighted analysis, you don't, so if you look into the package, if you just Control F weight, there will be a function saying, for example, C weight, and then you can just specify the weighting you want for every study. Zoe wrote me that you asked how you weight them. So the whole idea of weighting, you can do it two ways. Either after risk of bias analysis, you subjectively say, oh no, this is the strongest study, so we want to weight it 30 or 40, and just, you know, you say 0.4 for that weighting variable. For another one, if it's really high risk, because, for example, they haven't done it blinded, they have a low patient population, then you do 0.1. But that's all, you know, adding more sort of bias into your study, and you don't want that. So ideally what you want to do is just leave it completely to the program and not weight manually at all. So if you look here, we have the, for the treatment effect, you need to include your sort of like population size. And what R will do, it will automatically weigh it according to how many patients there are. So if we just go back here, and now let me just, right. Okay, so this work. Okay, so this is like for the treatment effect size. Let's see if this works, just so I can. One second. Basically, what will ideally happen is that for everything you do, for every study, if the study has a greater sort of patient population, I will account for it and make the circle in the middle, so this one bigger, and then you can just write into your legend, oh yeah, the size of the middle parameter, and you describe the symbol so that the black square is equal to the weighting of the study, which is equal then to the size of the population. Done. So that's for weighting. Fine. Right. So if you then get to a point where you are like, oh wow, we don't have enough data, trust me, happened to me a lot of times. And actually one of the projects I worked on, spent months trying to do meta-analysis. And the other day I looked at it again, I was like, oh wow, this is actually useless. So just scrap the meta-analysis. You don't want a bad meta-analysis because it'll just be wrong. And equally, if you don't have a meta-analysis, it's not the end of the world. You can still do, there are plenty of systematic reviews out there without a meta-analysis. You just need to approach it smartly. So a meta-analysis is a quantitative synthesis. A systematic review is a qualitative synthesis. Now, you don't want it to just be a simple overview. So ideally here you use a swim analysis, which is sort of like what Cochrane recommends to do if you can't do a meta-analysis. So swim analysis basically is an acronym for systematic review without a meta-analysis. And it's basically consists of like making tables and doing vote counting. So I think it's difficult to explain, so I'll just show a picture of this. So for example, if you're looking at a treatment X, and you're looking at, okay, how does it impact, identifying landmarks such as, the carotid artery, and how does it impact, the time of surgery? And then you have your 13 studies, and you just look at each study and see how each study evaluates it in that regard. So for example, study 4, all these studies have a positive effect or report a positive effect of the treatment on landmark identification, whereas on time it's more sort of spread. And ideally you want to do this in groups, so separately, everybody does it separately, and you vote basically on each one to reduce sort of bias. Because if you can imagine, if only one person does it, there's huge bias to it because you can interpret it differently. Whereas if 3 people do it, you minimize the bias and increase the validity of your findings. So just imagine meta-analysis here, even if you do no swim analysis, it's down here. If you do a swim analysis, it's sort of here. But if you do a swim analysis and don't do like blinded vote counting of multiple people, it goes down to here again. So yeah, you do that, and then ideally the sort of height of the bars, you can, even if it's a qualitative, you can always seek to make it better. For example, in this example, the color of the column means white basically means in vitro, so it's not even on a patient, just on a model. Black means in vivo, so it is on a patient, and gray means ex vivo, so it's on a cadaver. And the number of these correlates to the risk of bias analysis, with 1 being of poor quality and 4 being of high quality. And the height of the column is the same. Right. So in that regard, so once you have done everything, you structure the whole paper exactly how the journal wants. And there's specific ways of approaching how to write the manuscript, okay? So when you start writing the manuscript, you need to have a nice and professional looking cover page. So write it similar to how you would write a scientific thesis. You have your title, you have your authors, the institutions, the corresponding author, and then first authorship, which is, to be honest, a bit meaningless because neurosurgical journals, the good ones anyway, the top 10 ones anyway, they don't really take any first or second authorships. But yeah, basically have a nice cover letter, cover page, because when you send it then to supervisors as well, and the first page already looks nice and maybe even includes their names on it, it's just set the tone and it looks more professional. So once you got the cover page, write a cover letter to the editor. So find out who's the editor-in-chief and say, we're pleased to submit this original piece of research entitled blah, 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 blah. And then write 3 paragraphs of why you think your systematic review will add something new to the database and why it'll be meaningful. And there it's good to, find out who did something similar in the past and then try to, criticize them, or more appropriately, critically appraise them and point out their mistakes or gaps and tell the editor how you are sort of like filling the gap that others have left. and how your piece of work will change the paradigm of neurosurgery. And yes, once you've done that, you write the manuscript entirely from abstract to the conclusion. Then you put in your tables. So don't format your tables or your figures inside the text. Text, tables, figures have to be separated. And at the end, you have the references. And if you want, you can insert acknowledgements at the end. So that was a long talk. Does anybody have any questions? I've purposely left some time out just to address some questions, because I realized I probably didn't go over everything you need sufficiently. So yeah, just shout them out.